Hi, I'm Dr. Ehsan Garashadaki, also known as Dr. G with Therapy Cable. Thank you for watching our series here on families and addiction. We would like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you like some of these videos, and also leave us comments because we really appreciate your input, questions that you put on our website and channels, and we are eager to answer those questions either by in text format or even by creating new videos such as this one. So one of our viewers was wondering about the difficulties that families have and wanted us to explain that. How come families have difficulties helping an addicted family member? So this video is about that, difficulties that families are experiencing, why they're experiencing those difficulties. So I was able to really put together a list of 10 reasons and 10 difficulties specifically that families go through that are very significant and kind of universal amongst all families, at least most families that I have worked with. So the first one that comes to mind is a sense of betrayal. After many times of helping a family member who is struggling with addiction and failing at it to a point that, as we know, addiction, and by addiction we mean addiction to substances or gambling or sex addiction or any other types of self-destructive type of habits that make the person highly dependent on these activities or processes or substances. Both the family member and the addicted person end up in a very particularly damaging relationship to a point where addiction is taking control of the entire relationship, and the dependence on addiction becomes so high that the person who is addicted is completely oblivious to traditional values that the family has enjoyed in the past, especially values like trust, like depending on each other and not disappointing one another's expectations, to a point that at times an addicted family member may even go to the extent of, perhaps not intentionally, but to some extent willfully even hurting the feelings, emotions, or even physically hurting family members. To give you an example, for instance, people who are addicted to, let's say, drugs, and they have to maintain their drug use, and they run out of resources and finances, and they get to a point where they start lying to family members in order to obtain some resources, some financial help to keep up their drug use, to still buy the substances and drugs on the streets. And they go to the extent of even depleting, family savings, even, taking out money out of 401ks and pensions and saving accounts. And even I know of examples where family members have sold their homes and cars and jewelry and other assets, liquidated them in the hopes of thinking that they're helping their family member get out of addiction or get out of their problems, and yet they were in the end completely disappointed when they found out that all the money has gone to further drug use or other types of addictive behavior. So that injury to the trust that occurs ultimately leads to a sense of betrayal after having been lied to, cheated, cheated out of money, and at times even physically assaulted or hurt by an addicted family member who is so eager to satisfy their craving, and therefore are willing to cross such boundaries, family boundaries, and really do the unthinkable, including betraying their family members. That sense of betrayal weighs heavily on the family members, and they just have to live with that sense of betrayal and it is too much. At a certain level, that weight becomes simply unbearable, to a point where family members say, I've felt betrayed enough, to a point where I'm no longer willing. There's nothing left in me. There's no caring, no empathy, no compassion, no more energy even left, or even interest left in me to help the person that has hurt me so much. So that was number one, betrayal. Number two, lack of safety and protection. So as I mentioned, due to all these reasons, over time, family members may feel endangered and in a very unsafe situation, where they feel, if they don't protect themselves really against the addiction, and by extension against the addict, then they're shirking their responsibilities and duty for self-preservation and self-care, and really not just themselves but also other family members that are involved. That sense of protection, safety can sometimes extend to the safety of the house, of the home, of their assets, that they have to really protect themselves as well as assets that are at the mercy of the addict and his or her addiction. The third one is depletion of resources. So many times, after a few attempts of trying to help a family member and then running out of the resources that people have, especially in this situation, monetary resources, then there are no resources left. So family members may just be at the end of the rope and say, well, there's nothing left anymore for me to help, especially if you're talking about material help. But also that can apply to emotional resources and other types of resources. Perhaps, let's say, a number of family members that are willing to help. If a person has gone through more or less damaging multiple relationships, and there's no other family member left really, or willing, including extended family members that are willing to continue helping the addicted person, then again those resources have been depleted, so there's nobody left anymore to in terms of their energy and interest or financial or other means, such as, for instance, providing shelter and food for an addict. If an addict has depleted those resources by multiple relationships, there's no one else left to really help out with shelter and food, so they end up being homeless. And there is a finality to resources. It can't go on forever, and that's part of what addicts don't understand. And or if they did understand the concept at one point of time, the addicted mind, the disordered, diseased part of decision making and reasoning of the mind, literally ends up ignoring this concept of limits to resources. It lives a fantasy life, as if, no matter what a person does, there are other resources that are going to be available. And there is a sense of, I would say, oblivion, or futility to the whole process. They may not even care anymore whether or not the resources are available. They just continue the destructive path regardless of the logical, the rational aspect of reality. And the fourth one, I would call it identity, issue with identity. What I mean by that is that the family members, just generally, they have this identity for their family. Identity can be many times described by, for instance, the names, surnames, last names, maybe even some mascots or certain styles or of costumes, or habits in terms of the type of food that the family really enjoys, or type of vacation that they go to, a place that they live, their likes and dislikes, preferences. They form a certain identity for a family that are usually encapsulated within a greater identity, such as I mentioned, for instance, a name for the family, almost like a dynasty, if you will. People are proud of their identities. They're proud of the values that they harbor and cherish and share with one another. So once a family member goes outside of these perimeters and basically acts in a way that is contrary to those values and identity, ultimately the other family members may really question the belongingness of this addicted family member to their own sense of identity, who they are. And as a result, and this is more subconscious, I would say, rather than conscious, but still can surface to the level of consciousness that a few members in the family may just kind of decide, this is not who we are. And if we continue to associate with this person who chooses to be this way, or even doesn't choose but is really entangled in this dilemma and this storm and is taking us down with him or with her, then that's not us. That's not who we are anymore. So it's that very much existential sense of wanting to preserve that self identity that may create some resistance to helping the family member, because there's an existential line that is being crossed, and people may just feel at a loss of who they are and how they identify themselves and whom they associate with, and very much subconsciously start defying and almost rebelling against wanting to help a family member who is addicted. It's very much a self-preservation type of need that exists. The fifth reason I would call or categorize under shame. Shame, the feelings of being embarrassed and shameful and ashamed of a disorder, a problem that is highly stereotyping and stigmatizing, is so overwhelming that at times people really are completely overwhelmed by their sense of embarrassment and shame that their family member is struggling with such a problem. And therefore it's a debilitating sense of emotion. And when the person feels disabled, debilitated at that level where they're even just paralyzed, even grasping the reality that they're associated with someone who is struggling with addiction, that sense of shame is so overwhelming and so paralyzing that really leads to this different type of an experience where a person may not even have the ability or the willingness and completely be devoid of any notion of connectedness to their family member. So they and again, that's why I use the word disability and debilitation, because it's beyond a certain person's self-control. When shame takes over, we are literally paralyzed, and there is no action that can be taken. So a family member who feels ashamed about their let's say siblings or children or parents' behaviors, they completely really dissociate from that other person. Because again, it goes back to self-preservation. Shame is so debilitating that we cannot function, and we have to get out of it. So part of us rescues us from that paralysis that is brought on by shame by disconnecting ourselves from the family member who is addicted. We don't even want to think about it. We don't want to even be associated with it. Then that brings me actually to a very similar emotion. Number 6 is guilt. Same thing with guilt, in terms of at times family members may feel guilty for either having caused the problem, having been a contributor to the problem, or having been even associated in the past with the problem, having been connected with it, having maybe even enabled the person in their addiction. There's lots of different aspects that can lead to a sense of guilt. Especially the most prominent one, I would say, exists for parents, because parents have a general, natural, innate sense of responsibility and caretaking for their children. So even if they do their best, and despite all their best effort, let's say regardless of what they have done, the child goes and becomes addicted, they still feel a sense of guilt that they could have or should have or must have done something either wrong, or they didn't do something right, and ultimately they have been part of the formula, part of the contribution, part of the history. And that guilt too is very debilitating, to a point where it eats away at a person to an extent that they may feel like at times they should give up their connection with this addicted family member because they don't want to exacerbate the situation. Or they may feel that because they have been a cause or a contributor to the problem, they feel so guilty about it that they disconnect in order to just kind of live and brood with their own guilt, and rather than again cause more problem. At times, again, if they feel too much responsibility for not having done the right things, but again afraid of doing more destructive things, at least in their mind, they may then again disconnect from the family member and say, this is too much, maybe I'm better off, and the family member is better off if we don't even connect with one another, if we are not in their lives, if they're not in our lives. Now, it's not always how guilt manifests itself. A lot of times that can certainly be the opposite, in terms of it leads to the opposite desire and drive in a family member to be actually overly involved and participatory, and even to extent too controlling or even suffocating, and wanting to take charge of the entire treatment process or recovery of an addicted family member. But in this case, I'm focusing on the side that guilt may actually become an impediment to connection with family members and helping a addicted family member. Number 7 is what I would say a rivalry, but more accurately, I would call it balance of responsibility. So on the one hand, what I mean by rivalry is, there are multiple members in a family. So if one person is addicted and a lot of resources and attention go toward this one person, the other family members may feel neglected, not appreciated, left out, abandoned, and that sense will come across in one way or another, whether it's verbal, non-verbal, within intense emotional experiences, even to the extent of maybe blowout or major disagreements, and or very peaceful conversations about the sense of this lack of a balance or injustice, if you will, that is being presented through the imbalance in the attention and caregiving and resources that are being distributed amongst family members. So, and in fact, that can even happen between spouses. For instance, let's say if one parent is more involved in the either the maintenance of the addiction or in the recovery against the factors of addiction, and the other parent is not as involved, and then there is almost a schism or gap between the spouses that can occur. And again, that can seemingly appear as a rivalry, that again the attention of one person is being divided unequally between the other two family members. But and that's why I gravitate toward the more appropriate term, which would be less about competition and more about balancing resources. And again, in this case, it's more, for instance, that a couple may have had life savings, and one parent may feel that it's okay to spend that life savings on the recovery of the addicted child, and the other parent may feel that, no, that's their life savings, and they need that for old age and for retirement, and they shouldn't be just throwing it away because of the bad choices that have occurred in the past. So, and again, how do you balance that between the spouses? And that can lead to that type of imbalance of resources, and also to perhaps major discord between the family members. And as a result, then that can lead to, again, another need for disconnection from the addicted family member, because again, if the spouses are feeling that our relationship is important too, to the extent of saving it rather than allowing the discord leading to some kind of permanent disconnection, and like divorce or separation or even worse, then for the sake of saving this relationship, it may be better to preserve the relationship, the main relationship, but ultimately disconnect from the problem, if you will, as well as the person who is in the throes of the problem. Now, all these, I know that people hearing all these concepts that I'm going through certainly have their own judgments. Everybody has their own reactions and feelings, and all those are valid. There's no question about that. Every person reacts to these types of issues and concepts differently. We have different values and value systems, and we can go through that at a later time in different videos or different discussions. But right now, I just want to go through general categories that can help understand why families may be struggling with actually being able to, or willing to help a family member with addiction. The eighth reason is what I call sanity and self-care, as well as, again, self-preservation. This has been a kind of a common theme amongst the other categories, but I think it deserves its own category, to a point where if everything else has been done and a person really is completely depleted by having gone through all these emotions and feelings and experiences, and to a point where they feel they could lose their own sense of sanity, if they don't stop helping. That's that level of self-preservation that they can arrive at through any of these experiences that we mentioned earlier. But that's why I think it deserves its own category, because it deserves some explanation that self-care certainly is the core principle that helps a person even survive in this world. Every human being really exists as one unit. We have our own both physiological as well as psychological skin, if you will, boundaries around us. And we are literally just responsible unitary for our one own self rather than multiple people. We are one individual, one entity, one human being. So that by itself, both physiologically and psychologically, puts a burden and responsibility and pressure on us for self-preservation. We owe that duty to our own self. That's just one of the core, most prominent and profound rights, as well as phenomena that we own as human beings. So we have a right to it as well as a duty to it. So at times, having cared for others, regardless of the relationship, to the extent that we are shirking that responsibility, we are giving up on our own existence, it can be quite contradictory and counterproductive, for sure counterintuitive. And there is a level that a person will get to a point where their own reality testing and sanity may be tested, and to the point that they may question life. And that's again that existential point of journey, where they may even question the purposefulness or meaningfulness and of their own life or life in general. And that's a very dangerous level to get to, but a person can easily get to this level if they haven't stopped any of these other types of depleting factors and forces in that more or less is caused by addiction, I would say. And it's not only caused by addiction. There are lots of family dynamics, intrapsychic, interpersonal, psychological factors go on. But ultimately, I believe that is a danger that that people need to be aware of. And a lot of times, family members automatically, unintentionally, subconsciously get there to a point where there's a limit. They notice that limit and that they're just losing themselves, that have done too much, to a point where they have completely ignored themselves and now they're completely dysfunctional, or at the verge of becoming dysfunctional, almost like a nervous breakdown, if you will. And when a person notices that, they may shift gears and completely backpedal into more of a self-preservation and just kind of abandon or wash their hands off of the addicted family member. And at times that's the reason why they may stop helping in order to preserve themselves. Number 9, I call it philosophical and beliefs differences. I've had family members where, no matter how many times they have discussed these issues of addiction, drug use, or sex addiction, or gambling, or whatever other kinds of addictions are out there, but and they have tried to help, they have tried to come to a common sense with one another, they have actually made some progress, but then they have come to a point where they have noticed that they're philosophically just different from one another. Kind of principally, they are at a crossroad where they literally choose to really separate their own ways. To give an example, despite everything that one family went through when they were coming to work with me, after a few years of working through addiction and actually reducing the damage and getting to some kind of normalcy, the person who was highly addicted to all kinds of substances and so forth, so they continued actually in a very manageable way because of their belief system that using marijuana medicinally was beneficial to them, and there was a actual good physiological reason for it. The addicted person just decided that this is the lifestyle they needed to have, both medicinally as well as, again, philosophically. They didn't see any problem with using marijuana, especially now that it is legal, and they, without falling back into the throes of hardcore addiction and hardcore use of drugs, etc., under supervision and medical supervision, they continued, and they have, to my knowledge, even today, they're continuing for years using marijuana and not really becoming dysfunctional due to other drug use. But then the family members decided that, again, philosophically, principally, they could not agree with this decision because of everything they have been going through and the whole ordeal of addiction and recovery coming out of that. They decided that they're philosophically completely on two different frequencies, and really decided to just cut connections with one another. Almost on good terms, not with animosity, but actually kind of respecting one another's wish for future lifestyles, and it has worked so far, actually, for them. So at times you see that people, family members and an addicted family member, they literally come to a point where their belief system completely diverges, and they're no longer in each other's lives. Lastly, number 10 is fear of enabling, and that somehow is also related to earlier what I mentioned with guilt and shame and so those two categories. But so basically, at times, after having helped many times a family member who has thrown everything they've got at the addicted person, But then throughout the years, they have also been educated and they have been informed about the possibility that all their help or some of their help may have actually enabled the addict in their dependence and in their maintenance of their use or addictive style. Then the family member who is now much more aware and informed about this possibility of having enabled the family member, then they may come to a point where, because of this awareness, they notice that, you know what, maybe I'm better off not helping, because in the past my help has actually led to a lot more dependence, a lot more damage, and some kind of unwanted and unintended negative consequences. So perhaps it's much better that I step back and kind of more or less disconnect or distance at least myself from the addicted family member and let them figure it out by themselves, or be more self-sufficient and self-reliant and independent, or more interdependent rather than so completely codependent on one another. So that's some of the times the reason, the fear of even further enabling the addicted family member, that keeps a person from wanting to help or being able to help. And at times, and I'm kind of accidentally put that as the last reason, but it's a good segue to the concept of codependency and enabling. And there's very well recognized and real concept that does exist. We know it is part of the problem and the solution, and that's why also family members are a lot of times encouraged to attend AlANON meetings or NARANON or whatever other type of anonymous codependency education groups for family members, so that they can inform themselves about the depth of some of these behaviors that they're engaged in, to be able to differentiate what kind of help is constructive and what kind of help is actually destructive, to a point that enables the addict to further maintain their addiction. So I hope you enjoyed this video about the 10 reasons why families have a hard time helping an addict. And if you did, leave us a comment. We would welcome you to also subscribe to our channel and watch other videos. We appreciate your time and comments and thoughtful reflections and feedback that we get. That's what makes us tick, and we are looking forward to provide more videos for you. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful, pleasant day.